and welcome to Mysterious Events. I'm your host, Stephen A. Mackay, a writer and podcaster with a lifelong interest in the strange and unexplained. Today, I wanted to cover a topic that's affected, countless people, probably since we evolved from apes, and maybe even before that. Sleep paralysis. First though, just a couple of quick pieces of housekeeping. You might remember the last episode we covered the book The Jesus Mysteries. Well, best-selling author Gordon Docherty, who's written Assassin's Creed novels, as well as Hittite and Roman legionary stuff, is a listener of the show. He heard that last episode and sent me a voice message about one of the things I'd mentioned, namely the Emperor living a wicked life and then calling for a priest to baptise him on his deathbed. It's a nice idea. Live a life of debauchery and drunken fun, then repent just before you die, and find yourself in heaven once you pop your clogs. Well, Gordon had this to say about it.
You know the point about Constantine getting baptised on his deathbed? So that's the thing about that is the Christian tradition in the early days, and during Constantine's time and for a few hundred years after, that was actually the norm, getting baptised on your, close to death, on your deathbed or whatever, as opposed to the thing that we're used to now, which is getting baptised at birth. So it was your Augustine of Hippo, St Augustine. He was the one in the early 5th century who first coined the phrase, the concept of original sin. That's where everybody's born with a little bit of the sin of Adam and Eve. And that's where it became fashionable then to be baptised at birth, to cleanse yourself of that sin. And as I say before that, it was more like you were cleansing yourself before you went to meet your maker, so right at the end. Hopefully that adds something to the whole Jesus mystery kind of critique.
It's great to know we have a celebrity listener, so thanks very much to Gordon for that. He also contributed to the beer fund, and you can do that too if you want to help a struggling podcaster forget his woes for a while. Link is in the show notes. Next, a couple of listeners have sent me their own creepier paranormal stories, things that really happened to them. So, I thought it might be a good idea to do an episode where I take a look at your scary stories. If anything really spooky has happened to you, UFO sighting, poltergeist, run-in with a serial killer, anything like that, message me on social media or email me and I'll use your tale in a future episode. As always, links to contact me are in the show notes if you need them. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about sleep paralysis. Hopefully something you won't experience while listening to this podcast. Now, I know you all love Wikipedia and it's a great resource, but this week I found some good info on a different website, the NHS website actually, to explain what sleep paralysis is for those who don't know. So this is what the NHS website says. Sleep paralysis is when you cannot move or speak as you are waking up or falling asleep. It can be scary, but it's harmless, and most people will only get it once or twice in their life. Well, I'm not so sure about that last part. I've had it a load of times. In fact, I could probably bring it on pretty much at will if I wanted, but I digress. Let's get back to what the NHS say about it. During sleep paralysis, you may feel awake but cannot move, speak or open your eyes. Yep. Like someone is in your room. Yep, or at least coming towards your room. Like something is pushing you down. Must admit, that's not really something I've had. Frightened. No shit, Sherlock. It's absolutely terrifying. Well, to be fair, I had it so many times over the years that I eventually stopped getting too frightened when it happened. Don't get me wrong, it would still absolutely freak me out, but I wouldn't be thinking I was literally about to be hacked to pieces by a murderer. Instead, I would just feel a kind of normal fear that anyone would when they find themselves completely immobilised for no apparent reason. The NHS, which for those who don't know is the National Health Service in the UK, they say on their website, it's not clear why sleep paralysis can happen, but it has been linked with, and they list some stuff like PTSD, but, well, they say themselves it's not clear why it happens, so their list of causes is just speculation. Personally, I believe people with very active imaginations are more likely to suffer from the condition. I remember when I used to work in one of the whisky factories near Glasgow, there was a girl, I forget her name, but her claim to fame was playing a dead body in a Charlie Sheen movie, which I thought was great. Anyway, I was talking to her one day, and she was telling me about all her creative endeavours. She clearly had a great imagination. So I said to her, Derren Brown style, how do you deal with your sleep paralysis? Well, she went pale, her face fell, and she looked at me as if I was psychic or something, and she said, how did you know about that? I just guessed because she was a creative person, but the fact that I was right was really interesting to me, and it showed me my hunch was possibly correct, Imaginative people suffer this condition more than others. Now, do the NHS have any advice on how to avoid sleep paralysis? Yes. You may be able to prevent sleep paralysis by changing your sleeping habits. Specifically, they advise, do not eat a big meal, smoke, or drink alcohol or caffeine shortly before going to bed. I'm not sure about that. I don't personally find any of those make a huge difference when it happens. I used to burn incense a lot and suspected that might cause it, but I haven't done that in years, so it was probably just a coincidence. Just like all these other things that they mention. The second tip on the NHS website is much more helpful, however, and it does completely tally with my own findings. Do not sleep on your back. This can make sleep paralysis more likely to happen. Yes! I'm pretty certain that every time it's happened to me I've been lying flat on my back. In fact, it started to happen to me so much when I fell asleep in that position that it became clear that that was the main cause, so I started sleeping on my side. That was a few years ago now, and I've not had an episode since. So there you go, that seems fairly conclusive. If you don't want to suffer any more sleep paralysis episodes, follow Dr. Mackay's advice and sleep on your side. Scientific or medical theories for the condition are, of course, not the only ones people have to explain it. In ancient times, it was believed that a female demon, a succubus, was the cause. It seems many, or even most people who suffer from it often see a woman during their experience. A terrifying demonic woman who sits in your chest, crushing the breath out of you. This idea inspired the classic painting The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli, I don't know how you pronounce it, he's Swiss I think, which shows a naked woman asleep or unconscious in bed with a demon sitting on her chest leering at the viewer. It's pretty horrific and quite Lovecraftian, and gives you a good idea of what happens to people when they experience sleep paralysis. I'm 47 now and I've suffered with the condition since I was at least 17. I don't really remember it happening before then, or talking to anyone about it before that point, and it actually coincides with me buying and moving into my first house. I had a mortgage when I was just 18, so it's possible that kind of stress contributed to it happening. I was also reading some more mystical, spiritual books at that time, with a lot of mythology, fantasy, and even occult stuff, like Colin Wilson's book, which I seem to remember was just called The Occult. Things like that I was reading. So yeah, it could be my mind was just more receptive to that kind of weird of experience. So what usually happens to me is that I'll be lying sleeping quite happily. In the early days, it seemed to happen more as I was drifting off, but later on it would happen at any point in the night. So I'll suddenly wake up, or believe I've woken up, and somehow I'll know there's an intruder inside the house coming to get me. Again, around this time, I'd bought a couple of replica swords, like the Sword of the Witch King from the Lord of the Rings movies, and a cheap version of King Arthur's Excalibur. Obviously not historically accurate, but sharp enough to do you some damage. So I had these displayed in my living room wall, and it did worry me that someone could break into that room and have a massive sword to attack sleeping me with. So it's quite simple to trace where my experience was coming from at that point. Anyway, during these experiences I would know someone was in my house. Not a demon or anything like that, usually just a man. I'd sense them coming along the hall to my room, and sometimes I'd even be able to catch a glimpse of them at the door looking in at me. Now, I'm sure you can understand why this would be absolutely fucking terrifying for anyone. But then you add into the mix the fact that I could see everything, but I was physically paralysed and unable to move to defend myself. Think about that for a moment and imagine the fear it brings. You can move your eyes, you can see your murderer coming to get you, but you're unable to run away, scream for help, or raise a hand to ward off any attack. Genuinely horrible, it's something from a horror movie. Later on I came to realise that my eyes weren't open and I was not really seeing anything during these experiences. It was just my imagination at work. Now, there's actually a good scientific reason for sleep paralysis. When we fall asleep, our brain essentially paralyses us so that we can't move around, get up, act out our dreams, wander out the house into traffic, that kind of thing. It's a protective measure, and when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. The problem arises when this paralysis comes on just as you're moving into deep sleep, so your conscious mind feels alert, but your body won't let you move. You're having this frightening dream about a monster or intruder coming to get you, but your body has shut down all movement, so you can't move, and that, of course, just makes everything even more scary. It's really like two nightmares in one. I found this description on the Sleep Foundation website, which really hammers home what I'm trying to explain. During REM sleep, the body enters a state of temporary paralysis called muscle atonia. This state is likely a mechanism to prevent sleepers from injuring themselves by acting out their dreams. In sleep paralysis, the lines between sleep and wakefulness become blurred. As a person is at the edge of waking up or falling asleep, they become aware of their surroundings while their muscle paralysis continues for a few seconds to several minutes. This means that they can think, see and breathe while they lie awake, but they are unable to move their body. Yep, real scary shit. I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here. I've been giving you scientific explanations for sleep paralysis and it all makes perfect sense. I would say that about 99% of my own experiences follow the same pattern. Lying on my back with my eyes closed, a human intruder sensed somewhere in my house coming to attack me. However, I had just one thankfully, experience that was markedly different to my usual ones. This goes back to the early days when I was about 18 or 19 and living in my first house with just my two dogs who were very protective of me. I'd fallen asleep with the light on, the wee bedside lamp, and I was probably reading a book. So I woke up, or at least I believed I'd woken up. I could see my room with the light on, I could feel the dogs in the bed at my feet, and there was no feeling of terror. I could not move, however. As I lay there, a small being about the size of a child walked into my room, right up to the side of my bed and stood there. I'm actually getting chills as I remember this. It was a classic grey alien, like you'll have seen on the cover of Whitley Strieber's book Communion, and, well, all over pop culture nowadays. A small, skinny being with a large head, hairless, small eyes, no real mouth, and no real nose either, just a couple of wee dots for nostrils. This is what had just walked into my bedroom. I can distinctly remember it standing beside me, and then it turned and walked out the bedroom door, and there was another one that went with it that had been on the other side of my bed. Now, I just want to reiterate, this was not like any sleep paralysis experience I'd had before then, or since. In the 30 odd years I've been having them, this was the only time I had anything like this happen to me. And to make it even freakier, I had one of the old clock radios on my bedside table. You know, the ones with red light up digital numbers that told you the time in the dark. Well, I distinctly remember looking at this as the grey alien was beside me and reading the time. It was, let's say, I don't remember exactly, but it was, for talking's sake, 3:32 AM. When the alien walked out of my room, my eyes followed it as it went, and then a short time later I was able to properly wake up, like genuinely wake up. You know, I was fully awake at this point. And of course, I thought I'd had a nightmare, but I turned and looked at the clock and it was like 3:33 AM, like basically 1 minute after the time that I'd seen in this apparent dream. So that really freaked me out even more, because as far as I knew I was asleep with my eyes closed. So how the hell did I know exactly what time it was on the clock to within a minute? Was I abducted by aliens? Who knows? I did read a lot of magazines and books about the topic, so I was primed to believe something like that could happen, and did happen. I don't really think it did. I think it was most likely just a very realistic sleep paralysis event. True, it was different to any I'd suffered before or since, but it could just be that I ate something different that day and it slightly modified the chemicals in my brain that night. Or I'd seen an alien on the TV that day, or, you know, whatever. The X-Files was really big back then and I was a big fan. Me and my wife used to watch it all the time. And aliens were everywhere really. You know, remember that alien autopsy thing at the time? That was about that point. So, the thing is, I have a very fertile imagination. That's why I'm a novelist. My brain can create realistic, weird scenes. And we all know dreams can be crazy at times, even if you're not an author. What this particular experience did for me though, was make me wonder if reported alien abductions can be explained by sleep paralysis. You know, someone like Whitley Strieber, who famously got taken away by grey aliens numerous times in his life. His experience, and tons of others I've read about, closely matched what had happened to me, to some extent anyway, you know, the beginning of them. Now, I don't think you can explain all alien abduction cases so easily. Some abductees seem to have bizarre implants in their bodies and things like that that can't really be explained by a dream-like state. However, I would suggest that a huge number of reported abductions could definitely just be sleep paralysis. You know, events that aren't recognised by the experiencer. I put two and two together because I've had it happen so many times, and generally with only mundane hallucinations accompanying the experience. But what if you only ever had a handful of sleep paralysis events, and every single one felt like a realistic encounter with grey aliens? Of course you might think it was really happening. I wouldn't blame you. Seeing is believing, after all. You can then go further and ask if other supposedly paranormal events that occur at night are sleep paralysis. Ghost sightings, for example. I usually think a man has come into my house when I have sleep paralysis. And there was that one time I saw aliens. But what if you were more interested in ghost stories? Would you see or feel a spectre? Or what about those people who see fairies in the countryside? I mean, there have been many sightings over the centuries, and not obviously are admitted fakes like the Cottingley fairies turned out to be. I mean real accounts made by sober, upstanding people who say they saw fairies in the woods. Could it be the experiencer had drifted off and had a sleep paralysis experience, seeing a tiny man in leprechaun garb rather than an alien or a succubus? Why not? Again, I'm not trying to say all paranormal events can be explained away like this. Of course not. But perhaps some of them can. Probably quite a lot, don't you agree? I don't think this belittles or does away completely with paranormal or supernatural explanations for things. On the contrary, phenomena that cannot be explained in this way take on even deeper significance. So, what can happen if your body does not shut down your movement when you're asleep? Well, there have been famous cases where people claim to have committed murder while sleepwalking. Take the case of Scott Falater, who stabbed his wife in the middle of the night and then drowned her in the swimming pool. He claims he doesn't remember any of it, and it happened while he was asleep. Or Jules Lowe in the UK, who beat his own 83-year-old father to death while apparently sleepwalking. He was acquitted. It's a terrifying thought that something like this could happen to anyone, any one of us, without us even knowing that we'd done it. The human brain is a strange thing. No wonder our body shuts us down while we're asleep. On a lighter note, I had a friend years ago who would fall asleep on his couch every time he was drunk. The rest of us would be watching TV and stuff like that, and he'd just crash out. I vividly remember him waking up one night, absolute terror on his face as he looked at me, and then pointed at the wall and shouted, "Spider! Fucking spider!" And then he just lay his head back down and fell into a peaceful sleep again. Me and the other folk that were there thought it was absolutely hilarious, as well as bizarre, but when we told him about it in the morning, he had no recollection of it happening. So, sleep paralysis is bloody terrifying. As someone who's dealt with it for decades and, in fact, seem to have cured myself of it, what tips do I have for those suffering from the condition? Well, first, as I say, don't sleep on your back. To be honest, you should probably sleep on your left side anyway, as it helps your stomach digest its contents much better during the night. Have you ever woken up choking in the night from acid reflux? Sleep on your left side. Honestly, this is how I think I cured myself of sleep paralysis, so give it a go, and it'll definitely help your sleep in general. The best way I've found to escape the insidious clutches of a sleep paralysis episode once it's taken hold is to get my wife to wake me up. Now, this absolutely freaked her out the first few times I did it, because she had no clue what the hell was going on. But what you do is just grunt and make any noise you can. You're paralysed, so I don't even think I can open my mouth at the time, it's closed, but you're able to make a noise. So I found that I could moan and make these grunting noises loud enough to wake my wife, and then she would, obviously, wake me up, and that would be it. Spell broken. It's not nice for your partner, but after the first few times they recognise what's going on and help you, and all is well again. But is sleep paralysis really a bad thing though? Eventually, after about 25 years of it happening, I stopped being really scared when I had an episode. I was able to tell myself that there was not an intruder in the house, I was not about to be murdered in my bed, and it was all just a natural function of my brain. That might sound unrealistic to many of you if you suffer from this, but that's what happened to me. Don't get me wrong, it was still scary, because you're literally paralysed, and that's obviously deeply unpleasant. But I no longer felt the total horror of previous years. Just accept what's going on, remind yourself that it's not real, and slowly your body will relax and all will be well. Or grunt and moan until someone tells you to shut the fuck up and gives you a kick, and you'll quickly be back in the land of the living. Thinking about it now, we had a burglar alarm fitted a few years ago. And we also have the most alert little guard dog, Pippi. You'll already know her if you follow me on social media. She wakes me up if so much as a hedgehog wanders past the house during the middle of the night. It's incredible. I've never known a dog as alert 24/7 in my whole life. So, the dog and the burglar alarm have maybe soothed my anxieties about an intruder being in the house. The swords are all kept upstairs as well, locked out of the way, so maybe that's contributed to my lack of sleep paralysis episodes in recent years. Maybe something to think about if you're really struggling with it. Get a burglar alarm or a crazy wee dog. And obviously keep your swords well out of the way. But just the idea of whether sleep paralysis is a curse or perhaps a strange blessing that imaginative people have. I actually used my knowledge of it in one of my historical novellas. Night of the Cross was a kind of tribute to H.P. Lovecraft, but in a medieval setting, and with a hospitaller knight as the hero. So I thought it would be interesting to have him facing a more modern demon, some from recent folklore, so I decided on Slender Man. Here's a passage from the novella. See if you can recognise these feelings yourself, if you've ever had sleep paralysis. And if not, this really give you a good idea what it feels like. Sir Richard awoke, a sense of impending doom flooding through him, and he lay still, wondering what had disturbed his sleep. He could hear nothing, but the feeling of intense danger grew in him, and he made to reach for the sword that lay propped against the bed by his hand. Panicking, he realised he couldn't move, and he tried to cry out to warn Jacob, but his mouth wouldn't open. Terrified now, he strained to work his vocal cords, to make some kind of sound, even a grunt, but his body refused to respond, and he lay, pinned to the straw mattress as something came into the room. Jesus Christ almighty, what the fuck is that? The figure was incredibly thin, so black that the shadows seemed to shrink back from it, from its blasphemous outline. Its limbs were long, almost like an insect, but it was so tall that it had to stoop as it approached the knight, despite the high ceiling in the bedchamber. As it approached him, he seemed to hear a whispered chant inside his head, although the words were difficult to make out. The hospitaller struggled within himself, every fibre of his soul rebelling against the fear that stopped him from moving as the eldritch stickman crept up to stand next to his bed and leaned down. As the great faceless head came into view, Sir Richard finally managed to break the spell he was under, screaming in terror and lunging desperately from the bed to land on the floor, tangled amongst his bed sheets. "What? What's the matter?" Jacob had come instantly awake and stood, dagger held defensively before him, gaze darting around the room for signs of an attack before looking down at his master on the floor. "Lord God Almighty!" Sir Richard gasped, his eyes wide, staring at the door which was firmly shut, the latch still locked in place. "God Almighty," he repeated, making no effort to stand, but grasping the hilt of his sword and holding it against his chest, which rose and fell as if he'd been running. "A dream," he mumbled to his worried sergeant at arms. "Just a dream, although a very, very vivid one. Go back to sleep." He climbed back into bed and rearranged the thin covers over himself, the fear fading slowly as his brain accepted the fact there was no hellish stick figure in the room, and it had all been nothing more than a nightmare. Eventually, he slumped back onto the pillow, praying to God the dream wouldn't return. Now, does any of that sound familiar? I really like the passage because it's real to me. I could never have written it if I hadn't experienced sleep paralysis, so, perhaps it's not always a bad thing. Now, apparently something like 1 in 20 people have experienced sleep paralysis, but I'd be willing to bet that probably more like 10 in 20 listeners of this podcast have experienced it. If you have ever suffered a really terrifying event, something out the norm like my alien abduction, please get in touch and I'll do an episode featuring your stories. My contact details are in the show notes as always, or you can easily find me on social media. Just search for Stephen A. Mackay, author. Well, that's it for this episode of Mysterious Events. If you're enjoying the show and you'd like to support us with the running costs, you can buy me a beer at the link in the show notes. And if you'd like to hear more from me while you wait for the next episode, check out Rock Paper Swords, the historical action and adventure podcast that I co-host with best-selling author Matthew Harvey. The link is in the show notes again. Please also take a look at my historical adventure novels. Most are free with Kindle Unlimited. And my newest one, Sword of the Saxons, comes out on the 4th of July this year. Cheers all, and until next time, seek the mysteries.